Lord be with you. I just want to remind you that today is the third Sunday of the month, and on the third Sunday we have the extended homily discussion afterwards. And I've chosen a reading, and it's a long reading, so I'm going to invite you to sit down for it. Yeah. It's actually a record of an encounter I had on the 20th of November last year that I recorded. And I want you to, I'll try to read it as well as I can so that you can really envisage the encounter and that you can see what the other party in the encounter is describing. He looked ordinary enough, except that his eyes were special. They were kind and gentle, but also had a piercing, timeless quality. I felt, perhaps for the first time in my life, completely seen and unconditionally accepted. And I wondered what he was doing sitting on the banks of Pena Creek. Only once before had I encountered a stranger there. He was chewing meditatively on a blade of grass, and I could sense that he was debating within himself whether or not to share a big secret with me. To make it easier for him, I sat a few feet away and plucked a blade of grass for myself. In my mind, I said, "Tell me if you think I'm ready." He turned and smiled and said aloud, "Okay, I will." He began to tell me the strangest tale I've ever heard, outdoing even Daddy Jim, my druidical storytelling grandfather. And here's what he said. Once upon a time, there was a garden in a very remote location. To be precise, it was just a rock garden. Nothing grew there except crystals and diamonds and gold and coal and stuff like that. Then a family of gardeners discovered it and happily set about planting it with all kinds of shrubs and trees and grasses. They tapped into an underground reservoir and laid on an irrigation system, and they brought in natural fertilizers from their home place. The garden flourished. Occasionally they came back and did major weeding, plucking up many plants and replacing them with even more exotic ones. They began to graft flora from their own place, and the results were spectacular. Then they really got creative and began to genetically modify the plants. In time, this combination of planting, weeding, fertilizing, grafting, and genetic engineering led to a quantum leap. Fauna emerged from what had been up to then merely flora. Animals slithered and skipped, hopped and walked, ran and flew about the garden. Now the gardeners really warmed to their task. They continued grafting and weeding, fertilizing and gene splicing until a self-aware species evolved, tasked with turning free will, the ability to choose, into freedom, the ability to choose love. This program also allowed for the transition from self-preoccupation into compassion. The gardeners had conducted this experiment many times in other gardens, but they could never predict the results. Sometimes free will simply morphed into greed and self-concern into violence. Such gardens inevitably self-destructed in a tangle of competing weeds that eventually choked all life in the garden. They reverted to being merely rock gardens. Others made a major shift so that life forms emerged that looked like the gardeners themselves. But no two gardens followed the exact same sequence, so the gardeners were fascinated to see what would become of their latest project in their newest garden. With great care, they coaxed it along right up to the self-aware phase and waited to see what would happen. This time, the new species split into 3 subspecies. I'll call them Homo Naturalis, Homo Spiritualis, and Homo Sociopathicus. Homo Sociopathicus used their gifts of free will and intelligence to try to take over the entire garden. They claimed it was theirs to exploit and quickly set about doing so. They were takers who believed that the garden was merely a resource. They began to fight among themselves for dominion and soon developed biological weapons to destroy life in the parts of the gardens that they didn't yet own. Their weapons grew more and more deadly until, in their myopic greed, they invented weapons that could wipe out life in the whole garden. Meanwhile, Homo Spiritualis had been using free will to become truly free, and their concern was for each other and for the garden itself. They could understand the languages of all the other life forms, flora and fauna, and wanted to ensure that all the other denizens of the garden had their needs met and their views respected. It was very quickly becoming apparent that these givers would become the next phase of the evolution of the garden. They vibrated at a rate that transcended mere physical manifestation and could move in and out of bodies at will. Filled with compassion, even for the takers, they attempted to awaken Homo Sociopathicus to the catastrophe they were about to cause, but they were not afforded a hearing. Meanwhile, in the very remote parts of the garden, places even the takers hadn't discovered, there was a third subspecies, Homo Naturalis. Let's call them the innocents. These lived in aboriginal conditions with no outside contact. They'd never met or even heard of the takers, nor of the givers. And they were blissfully unaware of the fate which awaited the garden. The unthinkable finally happened. Homo Sociopathicus deployed nuclear and biological weapons in a frenzy of internecine warfare that got out of hand and soon killed the garden. But their leaders had long anticipated this possibility and had an escape plan. They took to the skies in their spaceships and abandoned the garden, leaving most of their own followers to die horribly in the radioactive cloud that enveloped the garden. Homo Spiritualis had also anticipated the event. They simply ascended into other dimensions as they had practiced, leaving their physical spacesuits behind them. They traveled until they found other gardens in which they could switch interdimensionally between physical and non-physical forms. By a quirk of nature and the direction of the winds, somehow the innocents survived the Holocaust. They were now unwitting heirs to the entire garden, and in time they traveled from their own remote habitats and discovered the vast extent of their territory. Eventually, they too evolved, occasionally stumbling upon artifacts of the bygone civilizations of the takers and the givers. They told stories about these finds and theorized as to what wisdom and technology these civilizations might have had. Thousands of years passed, and there were rumors that strange, powerful beings had begun to visit from the skies. Some of these were benign and helpful, and they called these the gods. Others were malevolent and destructive. They called these ones the demons. The gods attempted to encourage the innocents to move from free will to freedom. Whenever they found an innocent who could spontaneously shift into a state of consciousness that allowed him to surf other dimensions, they would teach him about great wisdom and about love. Occasionally, one of these ascended givers, these gods, would agree to incarnate as an innocent and be born to a Homo Naturalis woman, choosing to live a full life in a physical spacesuit and yet demonstrate unconditional love. The erstwhile innocents were now increasingly becoming more technologically adept and facing a new bifurcation point between their own version of takers and givers. So the incarnated ultra-terrestrials, the avatars, were often ridiculed, violently opposed, and even killed. It looked like, in Yogi Berra's famous phrase, déjà vu all over again. Meanwhile, the space-traveling Homo Sociopathicus had found another garden, but conditions there were such that they had to seriously decompensate in order to live in it. It was so dark and sunless a garden that their eyes became huge in order to be of any use to them. The garden stank of foul odors, so their noses shrank to mere slits in order to ward off these smells. They had been so badly irradiated as they escaped the Holocaust in their original garden that both males and females became permanently sterile. They produced progeny by cloning, since mating was no longer possible. Eventually, their genitals atrophied and were no more. Over time, the lack of food in this garden meant that they no longer had a need for mouths to chew, digestive tracts to metabolize, nor elimination systems to dispose of waste matter. They survived by chemical infusions. Mouths had now become mere gashes used only for communication, which eventually morphed into mind-to-mind telepathy. Their skin took on a pale, sickly grey colour. Most devastating of all, and this had already begun to happen even during their final years in the original garden, their sense of humour and their ability to empathise totally atrophied. They were a race without either laughter or compassion. But they continued to evolve scientifically, and soon they cracked the riddle of time, learning to move backwards and forwards in it. When they journeyed forward, they encountered a reality of even more atrophy, stagnation, and darkness, born of their determination to continue to pursue technology bereft of intuition and spirit. So they decided instead to focus on traveling backwards in time. Then things got very interesting. They figured out that by intervening in their own past, they could influence their now and so alter their future. They began a series of sorties to abduct, experiment on, and even harvest human and animal parts from the original garden as it had existed before the Holocaust. They were particularly interested in the physiology of the parts which they had lost through atrophy: nose, mouth, digestion, elimination, genitals. They were also experimenting on what allowed humans to experience emotions. The object of these harvests and experiments was to re-engineer themselves and reconquer the original garden, which was now far more life-sustaining than their present one. Some of the leaders of the innocence becoming Sociopathicus were aware of these incursions, but traded permission to continue with the abductions for new technology and training. So now, two versions of Homo Sociopathicus existed, and both were attempting to use each other to conquer the garden. The givers, Homo Spiritualis, had by now developed into angelic-like beings for whom compassion was the paramount virtue. Whenever they found an individual, a community, or a movement among the innocents becoming awake, they spoke to their souls, using them as channels to pour compassion into the garden in a race against the possibility of a new Holocaust. They became more and more creative, writing hundreds of love letters each year in the fields of the garden. The awakening innocents called these love letters crop circles. My grass-chewing storyteller went silent for a few moments. Then he turned to me again and said, "You know, don't you, that there are two kinds of fractals? Fractals in space and fractals in time? Space fractals are the physical patterns that are identical in shape and that repeat on an infinite number of scales. Examples have appeared in some of the crop circles. But there are also time fractals, patterns of behavior and of history that also repeat on different scales." And that was what was beginning to happen now in the original garden. The taker's return coincided with the technological evolution of the innocents become takers. These two waves amplified each other to create a tsunami of greed and destruction which threatened to do far more damage than the first Holocaust had. There was only one solution. The givers joined with the innocents becoming givers to shift the consciousness of the very garden itself. The garden quantum jumped into the fifth dimension, becoming invisible to, and thus uninhabitable for, the two waves of takers. The second Holocaust did happen, but it resulted only in the destruction of the physical level of the garden. The two waves of takers wiped each other out and were no more. Karma is the butter spread evenly upon the bread of life under the blade of compassion. In time, the givers came to realize that their revisited past was a present from their distant future. He stretched his feet into the waters of Pina Creek, and we both went back to chewing on our blades of grass. Here's what I want to do this morning. I'm just going to do 3 sections in the homily this morning. The first section, I'm going to try to just unpack what I've just read for you and explain to you what I mean by it. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the futures, plural. And then thirdly, I'm going to invite you to time travel with me. And then we'll open it up to a question-answer discussion, see what comes of it. So the first piece, let me just unpack this. This was a real vision I had on the 20th of November last year, sitting on the banks of Pina Creek in my home up in Healdsburg. And what I was witnessing, it seemed to me, was I was looking at the Garden of Eden in 7 of its phases. And the first phase I could see was a phase of the garden 4.6 billion years ago, when it was literally just the third rock from the sun in a particular solar system. And that was the first phase of the garden, just a rock garden. And the second phase of the garden was, this little garden was discovered by a group of space travelers. And they came down and they seeded it with life from their own place of origin. And they came back on a regular basis over millions of years and even billions of years, and they tended the garden which they had planted. So that was the second phase of it. The third phase of the garden was a life form evolved that was self-aware and self-conscious. And a ride in 3 different varieties, what I'm calling the takers, the givers, and the innocents. So the takers were the greedy, I'm going to call them Homo Sociopathicus, who were into greed and violence. And the givers were those who were interested in developing a kind of a Christ consciousness. And the innocents were kind of aboriginal peoples who lived in very secluded areas. So that was the third phase of it. The fourth phase was the Holocaust, the first Holocaust. And it was a situation in which, as I tried to explain in the story version of it, that they partially destroyed the planet. The takers refused to see where their actions were headed, and they partially destroyed the planet. But before this happened, they'd taken off. They developed technology to escape from the planet, as had the givers. The givers did it by shifting dimensions, and the others did it with just physical spacecraft. The next phase of it was that the planet is now owned only by the innocents, and the innocents begin to explore their terrain, and they come across the artifacts of these lost civilizations, and they wondered, who were these people that existed before them, and what became of them. And now the innocents themselves are also evolving, and they're reaching a bifurcation point of their own. They're going to be pulled towards innocents becoming givers, and innocents becoming takers. So there's another bifurcation point happening. The next phase now, this stage 6, is the original givers and takers come back to visit the garden for very different reasons. And when the original givers come back, they're experienced by the innocents now, evolving innocents, they're experienced as gods. And they come down, and the object of their intervention is to inspire the innocents to develop a Christ consciousness, on their planet. The takers are coming back, and they've got a very different agenda. Their agenda is the garden they've now inhabited is a foul, stanking place, and they've learned how to time travel, and they want to come back and create some kind of a system whereby they can alter the future so that they can occupy the original garden and own it again. Their greed is still the same, but their technology is different. And they're experienced by the innocents on the planet as demon or demonic kinds of forces. And then the final stage I saw was a second kind of a Holocaust. and this in some senses was more deadly. But this second kind of Holocaust didn't just pertain to the innocents, the species on the planet itself did a bifurcation. So there's a bifurcation on the denizens of the planet, where there are innocents who became takers now, and innocents who became givers now. And so the latter will shift consciousness into a Christ consciousness, and the former will continue to devastate the planet. And the planet itself will shift the consciousness, and it will abandon its physical spacesuit. And the physical spacesuit now will be the terrain of radiated remnants of the original takers, and the innocents become takers as they continue to destroy the physical carcass left over after the planet itself has shifted its own state of consciousness into a fifth dimensional place, which in some sense is paradise on earth. It is a Christ-conscious globe. So that's what the vision was telling me. So that's my first point. The second point then, I want to just look at the notion of futures, because it's obvious to me that there is no such thing as a predetermined future. There are probable outcomes of present behavior. And so you can predict what's going to happen on the basis of present actions and past actions. You can see where the graph is headed. But you can't say predeterminedly, this is the inevitability that awaits us. You can't ever say that, because free will is always at play here. We can change how we behave as individuals, as cultures, and even as a global species. So there is no predetermined future, but there's a predictability of what will probably happen based on present kinds of behavior. And so it's actually possible, to get information from the future. I've got two good friends, one of them, two scientists. One is a guy called Roger Nelson. He works at the PAIR Institute, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Group. And the other guy is Dean Radin, who is the chief scientist up at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And both of these guys, I was involved in a research group with both of them in the mid to late 90s. There was a group called DMILS, Direct Mental Influences on Living Systems. And my interest in it was a prayer study, how prayer at a distance can affect people's self-esteem, anxiety, and depression. And they were much more scientific in what they were doing. Roger Nelson had developed random number generators that could see whether or not people as a global community could anticipate global events. So I'll give you a typical kind of an experiment that these guys have put up. Dean Radin up at the Institute of Noetic Sciences created a bunch of really top-class, double-blinded, randomized, controlled experiments to see, to test what he called presentiment. Did people know before an event happened that it was going to happen? Was there any part of them that knew that? So typically, we can only react to sensory stimulation. So you're walking along a road and suddenly there's a man-eating tiger in front of you, and your eyes register it and your ears register the growl, and then your body and your emotions go into reaction mode. So you have all kinds of physiological and emotional reactions to it. So, but you have to be presented with the stimulus first to some part of your senses. That's the given wisdom, that's how it happens. Presentiment claims that there's a level of you that's aware of the energy that's around before the senses are presented with any information. So there's some part of the psyche that actually picks up on the energy of an encounter before the encounter happens. So a typical experiment that they will do up in the Institute of Noetic Sciences is to put somebody in a shielded room. Literally, it's magnetically shielded. And there's a computer in front of them. And there's a bunch of images that are going to be displayed on the computer, but they're randomized. And they're all different kinds of images. So it might be a tree, it could be flowers in the grass, then the next scene could be a horrific accident, the next scene could be a little baby in his mother's arms, the next one could be, a snake. And so they have the person who is viewing has no idea what the next image is going to be. And they're rigged up to some equipment. Very, very often galvanic spin responses that test the sweat levels. So, the autonomic system is going to respond to particular stimuli, or electroencephalograms, brain waves will react, or the heart will react. And the computer picks these randomly. Even the experimenter doesn't know what the next image is going to be. And with statistical significance, at levels of literally millions to one, statistically, possible. What's happening is that there's a part of the human being that's responding to the event that still has not been presented to the sensorium. So the heart is moving in milliseconds before the image comes on screen, or the galvanic spin response is registering it, or a brain wave is registering it. So there's a part of us, because we are pure energy beings, that are literally plugged into the field of information, that we're faster than our senses. And we're in contact with the energy, and we're having an emotional reaction to something that still hasn't been displayed to any of the senses. So there are hundreds of these experiments that have been conducted by Dean Radin. My other friend, Roger Nelson, created these, using these random number generators, which just randomly generate numbers, and he's computers all over the world, and he's wondering if there are major global events, can the randomization process be thrown out by some kind of a collective coherence in the group? And it happens with some frequency. Before the tsunami on the 26th of December in 2004 that killed about 230,000 people, these random number generators started to cohere all over the world. Before the 9/11 event, the very, very same thing happened. It's almost, if I were to use a phrase of my own, it's almost like there was a compassionate convulsion of the collective unconscious of the species. That there's a kind of a compassionate outburst that we experience before the event actually happens. That we're plugged in so deeply and so energetically to the planet itself that there's a part of us that is aware of what awaits us. And so the future can be experienced in the now before the data present themselves. So that's actually scientifically validated at this stage. Now, the people who specialize in thinking about the future, futurists like people like Ray Kurzweil, they claim that there's actually, I've talked about a bifurcation and a trifurcation. They're talking about four possible kinds of futures. And the first one is, natural evolution. It's obvious when you look at the human race over the last 40,000 years that we're actually getting smarter. Some of our decisions aren't very good, but we're actually getting intellectually brighter. We're living longer. Our health is better. We're more athletic than people who lived before us. So there's a natural evolution that's happening, and given time, this will continue to happen. So that's one stream of the future. A second stream of the future is surgically assisted evolution. And so we can enhance various components of the physical body. I mean, we're doing it already. People have pacemakers, and so we're already putting implants in the human body. What will happen when, and it's going to happen, what would you say, or how would you respond to an invitation, for instance, to have telescopic vision? If you could engage in surgery that would allow you to see the universe as clearly as the Hubble telescope sees the universe, that literally through eye surgery, that you had that kind of vision, how many of us would sign up for that? Yeah. Or if we could be surgically manipulated so that we could have night vision. I mean, there are animals, cats have it, bats have it already. So if it can be surgically assisted night vision, would you opt for that? Or what if you could, your eye could be manipulated in such a way that you could see into the infrared range and the ultraviolet range? Would you opt for that? And what about hearing? Suppose your hearing could be improved such that you literally had the hearing of a bat. Bats can hear up to 100,000 cycles per second. So you could literally have an acoustical image of everything you encounter. Not just a visual image, but an acoustical image. Would you sign up for that? What about if your sense of smell could be improved such that you could infer all kinds of information from a scent on the air, just like your pet dog does? You can infer all kinds of information. There's a toxin coming. I need to be careful. Would you sign up for that? What if your brain could be manipulated in such a way that through some kinds of implants that your IQ level could just go off the charts? Where literally your intelligence would be faster than any known computer. Would you sign up for that? And what if they told you we could artificially engineer your memory so that you never forgot anything ever again? Yeah? Would you sign up for that? Yeah? Big surgery for you. Or what if it said to you, we can engineer your consciousness so that you can volitionally access any state of consciousness you want? Or what if it said to you, we can engineer your consciousness so that you can be telepathic, precognitive, clairvoyant, clairaudient, clairsentient, all these kinds of things? Would you sign up for that? Because that's the future. That's one of the futures. It's happening. Now, is that frightening to you? Is it exciting to you? So that's the second stream. A third stream is that at some stage, because carbon-based life is really fragile, something falls in you and you get killed, hits you in the head, and you die. If it's possible to download your entire personality, all of your experiences, your memories, etc., into a machine that you can clone and make copies of, backup copies, so that if anything happened to one version of it, there'd be other versions of it there, so you'd literally be immortal. You couldn't be killed. Would you sign up for that? Yeah? Okay. Because that's a version that's coming as well. Yeah? And the fourth version is even more daunting. It's a version in which we're making computers so smart that they'll begin to program themselves. And at some stage they'll be much, much, much smarter than human beings, and they'll realize that human beings are a total encumbrance on the planet. They're not needed anymore, and in fact, they better be taken out of the equation completely. And they take over, and they wipe us out, because we're a scourge on the earth, and they're more intelligent, and maybe even more moral, and so they'll shepherd and, steward the planet much better than we do. So they're the four groups that they talk about in the future. I see a fifth group, and the fifth group for me is a subspecies that doesn't depend on matter at all. So all these four groups depend on matter of various kinds, whether it's carbon-based matter, or silicon-based matter. I see a version where consciousness will be independent completely of matter, and where consciousness can manifest in a material form or in a non-material form, whichever it chooses, in any of these ways. So those are the possible futures, which brings me to my third point. Since it is possible to visit the future, I want to invite you to try it this morning for a few minutes. Yeah? Firstly, I want to redefine imagination. I've said this to you many times. Imagination is not the ability or the faculty to make up things which are not real. It is the ability to travel interdimensionally and bring back information either from future times or different states of consciousness or different dimensions, and cross-fertilize it with this time and this present kind of reality. So if you're interested in doing it, I'm going to invite you to join me on a trip for maybe 10 minutes. Yeah? Into the future. In fact, into 3 different futures. And so I'm going to just kind of help us to induce a light trance in a technique I've used many, many times with you before. And then I'm going to do just a breathing exercise, then a muscle relaxation, and then I'm going to create a visualization and invite you to take it forward in any way you want. So I'm going to count back from 10 to 1. And as I start at 10, I want you to turn your eyes up to the left without moving your head. Just turn your eyes way up to the left and hold it there. At 9, swing it over up to the right and hold it there. And I'll oscillate backwards and forwards down to 0 and then invite you to close your eyes. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. So just close your eyes and relax. And just for a few moments, just watch your breathing. The breath is the interface between matter and spirit. In many, many languages, a single word means breath, life, spirit. And so it's the interface between the materiality of you and the trans-physical part of you. So just breathe in comfortably. And as you're breathing, I want you just to imagine that you're in the mountains and you've discovered a beautiful, pristine lake filled with beautiful, magical, mystical, clear waters. And I invite you to begin walking in gently. And at first you can feel this healing energy on the soles of your feet and in your ankles and insteps. And every place it touches, it brings healing and it brings peace. And every time you breathe out now, you can let go of any tension or discomfort in that part of your body and relax. And as you continue walking into these magical waters. You feel the energy moving up into your shins and calves and knees. And every place it touches, it brings healing and it brings peace. And every time you breathe out now, you can let go of any tension or pain or discomfort in that part of your body and relax even more deeply. And as you continue to walk into this pool of cosmic compassion, you feel the energy moving up into your thighs and quadriceps and buttocks and pelvic area. And every place it touches, it brings healing and it brings peace. And every time you breathe out now, you can let go of any discomfort or tension or pain in that part of your body and relax a little more deeply. And as you continue walking into these pristine waters, you feel the energy moving up into your chest and rib cage, up along your spinal column, touching all of the internal organs, your heart and lungs and liver and kidneys. And every place it touches, it brings healing and it brings peace. And every time you breathe out now, you can let go of any discomfort or tension or anxiety in that part of your body and relax even more deeply. And now you become aware of your hands trailing in these magical, mystical waters. And you feel the energy in your fingers and palms and wrists. You feel it in your forearms and elbows, in your biceps and triceps, right up to your shoulders. And every place it touches, it brings healing and it brings peace. And every time you breathe out now, you can let go of any tension or pain in that part of your body and relax even more deeply. And finally, you walk completely into these mystical waters and you feel the energy moving up into your throat and neck and chin and jaw, into your mouth and nostrils, into your eyes and ears, right up to the crown of your head, touching all of the internal parts of you, your intellect, your imagination, your willpower. And every place it touches, it brings healing and it brings peace. And every time you breathe out now, you can let go of any anxiety or fear and allow yourself to relax completely. And in that relaxed state, I invite you to dive down deeply into this pool. It's mystical waters. You can breathe seamlessly and easily below there. And you find a cave entrance and you swim through it and you find a long, elegant corridor stretching off into infinity with doors on the right and doors on the left. And you realize that all of the doors on the left represent years of the past. Last year, 2 years ago, 15 years ago. And all of the doors on the right represent the future. Next year, 50 years' time, 100 years' time. I'm going to invite you over the next few moments to visit 3 rooms from the future. To visit the room that says 100 years' time on planet Earth, and the room that says 500 years' time on planet Earth, and the room that says 1,000 years' time on planet Earth. And I'm going to take you into each of the rooms for a few minutes and ask you just to record your impressions of what life is like on planet Earth in that space. So when you're ready, I want you to swim down that corridor and open the door that says planet Earth, 100 years' time. To step inside. And for the next 2 minutes, I'm going to remain completely silent. And I want you to see and to witness what the earth looks like in that place at that time. And now I invite you to leave that time, to come back out into the corridor and to swim further along until you see the door that says Planet Earth, 500 years' time, and to step inside. And for the next 2 minutes, I will remain completely silent as you witness the planet at that time. And now I invite you to leave that time and to come back into the corridor, swim further along until you see the door that says Planet Earth, 1,000 years' time, and to step inside and to witness the planet then. And now I invite you to leave that time period, come back into the corridor, swim back through the tunnel into the lake, and swim to the surface, and walk out onto the beach, feeling the sunlight drying your body. and at your own pace, as it feels good to you, I invite you to bring your attention and your awareness back to October the 20th, 2013. And when you're ready, just open your eyes. So I'm going to invite us now just to open it up for the discussion. We can talk about the content of the homily, or more importantly, what your experience was like, if you care to share it with us. Jean, we just wait and we get the microphone. Yeah, one second.
Okay.
Are you on? Is it on, Michael?
So, anyway, so let's see. The first room, the 100 years, right?
Okay.
I saw the earth as whatever I was looking at, as a coal, a piece of coal, like a burning, a burnt piece of coal. There wasn't a lot of flame coming out, but it was definitely black, and it had holes in it, like a big piece of coal. There was a little bit of flame on one side, a little bit of flame. There was some kind of a structure that I could see the flame through, but just one little piece of structure. But I just saw it as a burning piece of coal, a hot coal. But it wasn't flames all around. It had already been burnt. Okay, so the second room, and then I started to get some thinking to it, like where was I? Where was I looking from? But the next room, I just saw a little black dot, and it was out in the galaxy, and there were stars around it. But when you said Earth, I just saw it as a tiny little black pebble. And then I was wondering, where was I? Where was I doing the looking at? I started to get too much think. Okay, the third room, it was like just nothing. It was like I was just floating in space, but there was nothing else there.
Okay.
Everything was disappeared. I didn't see anything. But it wasn't unpleasant. But then I started to wonder, was I part of that? Okay. I wondered where I was.
Okay.
Anyway, I didn't see anything.
Okay, thanks a million, Jean. Fabulous. Anybody else want to share what their experience was? Jane, do you want to grab this?
I saw more population explosion, just tons of people everywhere.
Okay.
And rising tides and less land and not enough food and things like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
At all three stages, or?
Yeah,
Okay.
it just got worse and worse. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, lovely. Anybody else want to share? Katie?
I decided that each time that I would stay where I was and that I enjoyed where I was. And it was very simple. Life was simple. And somewhat, like I have done that to my house. I made my house very, it's simple. Right now it doesn't have much food because I don't know how to cook.
Sounds like me.
But I was growing food,
Okay.
and I enjoyed that. And I have a fountain that's man-made, and I love it completely. Just, as much as you can love a thing. It just makes my heart happy.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Katie. Karen?
So at the 100 years, can you hear me?
Talk about
At the 100 years, it was, I felt like everyone was gearing up for a real fight. That there had been a lot of activity and a lot of growth in the environmental movement, but there was an equally sort of devastating piece on the other side, and that there were areas of where the earth was really suffering, it was really scarred and black, and then there were these tended areas that people were struggling to. I guess part of what I felt was that there was a big upsurge in the sort of environmental, taking care of the environment, but they were really geared up and strong against the others. At 500 years, something had happened, and the landscape was very sparse. There were just a lot of really tall trees and a lot of rocky surface. At 1,000 years, it was very much dominated by physical structures, it seemed to me, that there were still garden areas, but they were contained. I couldn't get away from kind of sort of futuristic building spaces, everything white, everything sterile, and then these pockets, but within the buildings of greenery. So,
Great.
not a pretty
Excellent.
picture.
Good. Laurie.
I had an interesting thing. I started in the first door, and sort of the negativity came up, and then I decided to choose to imagine that it became less fun for the negative people and concentrate on the people who were putting out this positive, loving energy. So then when I went through the next door, I had the thought again of bleakness, and then I said, oh, but what if we're now evolved to a point where we're sort of in and out of our bodies in a different form, and it's not fun to be in that negative, destructive space, so they're going away. And then when I went to the last door, it was like one with the universe you could choose to be in the past or future or anywhere, and yet we still had this inquisitive nature to be part of watching things happen, watching a flower grow, but it was not just here in this planet anymore.
Beautiful.
But I just kind of decided to choose that.
Great, Laurie. Thanks a million, Pat. Anybody? Lisa and then Nancy. Lisa first and then Nancy. Lisa Jean.
My vision was of being like on a hilltop, overlooking like a landscape of, like a typical city. And in each successive time period, 100 years from now, it was, kind of less complicated. A lot of the signage of buildings and things had kind of disappeared, and then each successive time, 500 and 1,000, it became simpler, more tranquil. At 500 years, all the roads had disappeared. There were just sort of these very harmonious, sort of kinds of buildings that just sort of fit into the landscape. At 1,000 years, it was mostly verdant, green, beautiful, very few structures. There was a sense that there was aliveness with tranquility, with a much smaller human footprint, that it was there, but somehow much more in harmony with the surroundings. The experience of it was a lot more a feeling than an actual image.
That's brilliant.
Of just what it was like, and it was very peaceful and very hopeful.
Fabulous. Thanks a million, Lise. Nancy?
Very interesting that in sharing these experiences, how varied they are. Mm-hmm. But mine lines up more with Lisa's in the sense that I felt the planet was greener than it was blue, so I don't know what has happened to all the water, but somehow, and there was, the spirit was one of nostalgia for maybe our memory of what Earth was in the past. So that was 50 years. By 100 years, I felt like I was someplace like Hoover Tower, where you know the city of Palo Alto is heavily populated, but all you could see were treetops. But the people that I did see were all the same color. And I don't know if that was immense amount of, we're all the color of honey, of all the races had intermarried, and we have evolved into, or moving towards all looking alike in a sense. Not that we didn't have distinguishing qualities. 1,000 years, all the signs of modern buildings had disappeared, and we really didn't need housing, because if we wished to be warm, we were warm. So I'm probably millions of years off, but it was more, we lived more through what we wanted for ourselves and what we imagined. So I probably haven't done it justice
It's beautiful,
with
Lindsay.
my words, but
Beautiful.
it was a very green place.
Brilliant.
So
Brilliant.
nostalgia rules.
Okay, thanks a million, Pat. Anybody else? Ria?
Hi, can you hear me? Is it
Right,
okay?
hold it up really closely.
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay.
there you
Okay. I went with the premise that we were all getting more intelligent,
Okay.
so that things were getting better.
Okay.
And I started off feeling that throughout time, things have been improving for the general person. So at 50 years, I had this image that all cars were really small, that we were much more cognizant of what was happening to our environment. Global warming had stopped. Things were very green. And then when it moved on to the 100 years, we were working even more together as a world. That we were realizing that we couldn't continue like all this constant fighting. And in 1,000 years, like Nancy, I felt, to me, there were a real lack of white people.
Okay.
That there was this, a mixture of the races, and we were much more in harmony, and realized that we really had to all pull together. But throughout that, I was thinking about population, and I never really addressed that.
Okay.
That how do we stop our population? Anyway.
Great, thanks, Ria. Thanks a million. Brilliant. Lorraine?
Funny, but mine was kind of intuitive experience.
Okay.
I think within 100 years, we kind of wipe out ourselves. 500 years, something happens to our planet in the universe, some kind of intergalactic event. And in 1,000 years, it's more like panspermia
Okay.
with what we were as planets and beings.
Okay.
And then if I could, is it okay also to talk about the homily?
Go for it, absolutely. Whatever.
I find it
Okay.
really intriguing how you began the homily when you talk about your encounter with this being
Okay.
and the eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just going into my experiences
Okay.
of being like that, light
Okay.
beings that manifest.
Okay.
And to me, they're kind of like resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
And before the ascension, obviously, but the look in the eyes, it's like the body is light, and then
Yes.
there's just so much in the eyes. And I'm wondering about this being. Have you seen the being again, or?
I've seen this being many times in different places.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
interesting. And then you talk about everything happening in time, but everything is also just a state of being, and it's timeless, and all of these things are happening right now. I mean, there's souls that don't rise, that they're in the ionosphere, and they're malevolent souls. You know, it's just really something. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Lorraine. Anybody else want to come in? Tom, and then Margaret. Tom.
Yeah, I had trouble doing the future visualizations. And one of the reasons is that while I greatly believe the pictures that you've come up with, I also go back continually to what you've also said, that I have a body, but I am not my body. And I think what you were talking about today was the body, was not the spirit with reincarnation. So if you die as a taker, to learn, you wind up going into a giver's body or into a Naturalis body.
Right.
And I think perhaps the same is true of the planet. Gaia has a spirit and it has the planet, but it is not the planet, it is the spirit which is inhabiting the planet. And the power and the path that the spirit will take us on and is taking us on.
Right.
I guess I don't feel was represented in a way that facilitated my looking at it 100, 500, and 1,000 years.
Okay. I hear that, Tom. I tried to address that very briefly when I said there were 4 possibilities that the futurists claim. I said I see a 5th, that it's the ability not to depend on material at all, the ability to shift in and out of physicality. So for me, when I talked about the second Holocaust, the planet was doing that by shifting into a 5th dimension. So it was the soul of the planet that was choosing, to identify with its essence rather than just its physical form, and for the beings to shift into a Christ consciousness and not identify with their forms. But I agree. I just give it a little bit of airtime at the end. Yeah, great.
But if that's
Okay.
the vision,
Yeah,
I can go with that very
great.
easily.
Sure, great.
Then I just was not able to take that into
Okay.
the 3 doors.
Okay, go back with it yourself, in your meditation, Tom. Take that in through the 3 doors and see what the experience is like for you. Great, thanks a million. Great point. Margaret Park.
We've gone through this kind of thing so many times. I am not able to go into the water and immerse myself.
Okay.
I don't get a vision of this. It's
Okay.
it's like it's in my mind.
Yes, that's fine.
And at first I saw the earth. The 3 visions or whatever were just of the planet,
Great.
and not necessarily the people on it. I thought of the earth, the planet, as blue water
Okay,
with just a little bit of green.
okay,
And then next it was a lot more green,
Okay.
not so much water.
okay.
And then finally it was a lush, just a lush green place. So it went from water to a little more green and then a very lush place. So I didn't see spirits, I didn't see people. And when I say see, I didn't see, I thought.
That's a very important point, Mary, because we think that imagery has to do with visual kinds of pictures. It doesn't. Imagery is having any contact with an experience. It can be auditory for some people, it can be kinesthetic, it can be just a knowing, a wisdom that comes with it. So that's a perfectly valid form of imagery. Yeah, thanks a million. Yeah. Chris, go for it, Chris. Yeah.
At the 100-year point, I saw a massive crowded favela of these pod-like cities.
Okay.
And I tried to envision what people were like, and I didn't get that sense. I thought what I got was what you were kind of describing as the people with no mouth, and that they didn't really communicate with each other.
Okay.
It was like this existence, and there was no interaction.
Okay.
It was kind of odd, very crowded, and just but then when you said, you mentioned when I was trying to remember what I saw in the 500, it was like a blank, and now I got back and I was like, because it was a very dark vision of like two mountaintops with just, and very dark, cloudy, and just two like castles, not castles, but more modern structures on top of these mountains and nothing really happening.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the 1,000-year mark, I saw just a lot of the earth was water with just little tiny sandy idyllic islands, and it seemed like I got the impression it was very primitive restarting or some kind.
Interesting.
But very idyllic.
Okay. Brilliant, Chris. Thanks a million. Thanks a million. Carmen Sita. Carmen up here, Mike.
As soon as I opened the first door, it was an explosion of technology.
Okay.
And it was for the better.
Okay, great.
And that was really what I saw.
Brilliant.
On the 500, I think it was more my mind, the vision.
Okay.
And I saw no more wars.
Okay.
And lots of greenery, the planet. And on the third one, the 1,000 one, I only saw spaceships.
Okay. Okay. Brilliant. Thanks a million. Thanks for you. Carmen. Tom, were you, okay, Kim, great. Your cousin Michael.
Well, I was thinking about the homily where you have the three groups, the innocents, the compassionate, and the takers. And I was just wondering if within each person there is all three of that.
Brilliant. That's brilliant. Do you want to say something about that yourself? Yeah, I agree to it. Yeah.
Well, I kind of sense that might be the case
in
each person.
Totally, absolutely. The first enlightenment and the first alignment has to be within the individual person. As Gandhi said very famously, be the change you want to see in the world. So we're all struggling with the kind of the prodigal aspect of the self and the shadow material. And getting that into alignment is the first stage. We're not going to change a culture or a community until we've gotten ourselves aligned. Brilliant point. Brilliant. Jonathan, did you have your hand up? Okay. Good. Guys, I want to thank you. For me, this is a very important, powerful exercise because there is no predetermined future. You know, we look at trajectories and we look at kind of patterns and we look at people's behavior and say everything that everybody said here today is a possible future, depending on the choices we make. But we have choices. Every single one of us has choices. And we have to begin with ourselves. What are the choices that I make that create compassion in my relationships? You know, and what are the activities we engage in as small communities like COJ that create compassion? You know, and what do we do as, you know, a county or as a state or as a country? And so we have to begin with the self. And it becomes really, really important then that we create a vision, because thoughts manifest. Any thought which is returned to with frequently and given a lot of energy, it manifests. It's either going to happen at a later stage of this life, or we're going to create a lifetime in which this will be the truth. And when we dream as a culture, literally our experience of reality is a shared trance. That's exactly what it is. When a group of people come together and decide upon a reality, that becomes the reality. And you can have totally different cultures, you know, experiencing the same world and having totally different models of what's out there. So literally it is our memes, our propaganda, our stories, whatever word you want, our interpretations. This is what creates the future realities. And so all of these are possibilities. Now the question becomes, which one will I give energy to? Which one will I continually dream about? Which one will I aim at? Which one will I try to become myself and try to inspire in my relationships, my communities to aim at? And that's what will happen. It's going to be this green, verdant, beautiful place. There's going to be this, as Jean put it so really powerfully, this lump of coal, this smouldering coal. Either of them is possible. Great. So thanks a million for your patience, guys. Thank you. So before we continue with our Eucharist, let's take time out and offer each other a sign of our peace.